Hey everybody, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology, bringing you another chart reading. And today I'm going to be looking at the chart of Conor McGregor. And if you'd like to follow along, his birth information is July 14th, 1988 in Dublin, Ireland. And we do have a birth time of 1:30 a.m. If you don't know who Conor is, he is an MMA fighter, mixed martial arts fighter, and he most recently had a boxing match with Floyd Mayweather, and he was kind of crossing over into a new style of fighting. And basically he hasn't fought in the MMA in a while, over 400 days or something like that. So recently it was announced that his title was going to be stripped, which I initially thought was part of the trouble that he's found himself in. But actually what it turns out is that he basically came from Ireland with a bunch of people with him, and they showed up yesterday at the place where this big UFC fight's going to be happening on Saturday, and he was caught on video throwing objects at a bus that had a lot of the fighters in it, and it crashed a window, and some of the debris caused 2 or 3 fights to be canceled because of the damage it did to the fighters. And so apparently this happened because one of the fighters on the bus had an interaction with one of Conor's fighting partners, and so Conor was in some way maybe like showing up to defend his friend. But there's some question as to whether this was perhaps a staged event that went a little bit too far. You have Dana White, who I guess owns the UFC, initially saying how disappointed he was in Conor and how disgusted he was in Conor, but now is not committing to actually banning Conor from fighting because, of course, you know, this is generating a lot of publicity, not only for the UFC, but for this fight that's coming up on Saturday. So there's some question as to what's really going on, but Conor was arrested and has 3 misdemeanor assault charges against him and one other one for something else. So, you know, it's serious and it's happening. So let's go ahead and look at his chart and see what's going on. And it's so interesting to look at his transits because I'll tell you, astrology doesn't lie. It really shows up at the right time and can describe what's going on in somebody's life. But let's just first look at his natal chart. He is a Sun conjunct Moon in Cancer. His Sun's at 21 degrees and his Moon's at 23 degrees. Well, if you follow astrology, and I'm just going to jump right into the transits, you know that Pluto is right at that 21 degree Capricorn position. So Pluto is opposing Conor's Sun, and this started in April, and it's going to end in November of 2020. So he's just beginning this particular transit. And to have Pluto opposite your Sun, first of all, is very rare because Pluto moves so slowly. Most people don't even experience Pluto opposite their Sun in a lifetime. So to have it in your lifetime is rare, and so it's significant. You know, you're really going to feel it. It's because it's such an unusual transit. And I wanted to read something from a website called futureminders.com, and they say about Pluto opposite the Sun, and let's just first talk about that a little bit. So the Sun is our solar energy, our light, how we shine out into the world, how we radiate. And then the transit of Pluto from an opposition, 180 degree angles from the Sun, oppositions always bring in the other because they represent the first house, 7th house axis, the self, the first house, versus the 7th house, which is relationships and partnerships. So whenever you have natal aspect or a transiting aspect of an opposition, it plays itself out in the area of relationships in our life. So we know that about this transit. Then if we think about what Pluto is, Pluto is many things. It's power, it's drive, it's the ability to transform, go through transformation. Sometimes it can be this dark energy that kind of draws us into the what you might call the seedier side of life, and if you think about this behavior that we're seeing from him, it's kind of like this transiting Pluto opposite Sun playing itself out, but not necessarily in the most elevated of ways. It's not necessarily causing him to self-reflect, although that might happen, self-reflect and transform. But right now, it's starting with this bang, and it's like he's like acting like a criminal. He is being a criminal. So this is what the Pluto opposite Sun transit that the Future Minders write about says. It says, your ambition and drive for personal recognition is very powerful, and you're compelled to push forward no matter what obstacles stand in your way. You're more capable of ruthless or compulsive behavior, because that's Pluto. Pluto, when it is not expressed in a very conscious way, it can express itself in compulsive drives where we're just taken over. We don't take the time to think or to grapple with these emotions and feelings. We just are overcome with this desire to act, and it can be very compulsive. It says that you are more capable of ruthless, compulsive behavior, which will cause you more problems when dealing with other people. You won't tolerate any opposition to your efforts and will find yourself frequently embroiled in power struggles with others who feel threatened by the level of sheer determination that you're expressing. You're more compelled to overpower them rather than cooperate, and won't be inclined to compromise. You may also have to contend with very powerful people who try to exert their significant influence over you. Power struggles are common now, but usually unproductive. I think that's a very good point. You should try very hard to use your powers of persuasion to convince others of the benefits of joining you rather than encouraging their opposition by being completely inflexible. Being stubborn and thinking only of your own needs will cause you problems, and you can accomplish more by getting a larger overview of the situation and affecting change more gradually. Of course, this will be very difficult now, and you're often compelled by inner desires that are hard to control and that you may not fully understand. So, it's right there. Transiting Pluto opposite Sun. I mean, if that's the only transit we talked about right now in his chart, it's clear as day to me as an astrologer that this is the energy that is playing out in his life right now. So let's go back to his natal chart and talk a little bit more about it. I did say he has that Sun-Moon conjunction in Cancer. And in Cancer's the water sign. Cancer's about our emotions and our feelings. So he's definitely someone who is instinctual. He responds to his feelings. He probably can, that alone can probably be very overwhelming for him at times, to just have such strong emotions connected to his solar energy and how he shines out into the world. But what's also interesting about his Sun-Moon conjunction is that it trines his Mars. It's slightly wide between, his Mars is at 0 degrees Aries. So it's an out of sign trine to the moon about 7 degrees and to the sun about 9 degrees. But it's still a trine nonetheless. So this brings in, Mars in Aries. Mars is in its home sign of Aries, and it's comfortable there. It's the warrior. It's having a lot of courage, So that energy really probably helps him in his fighting career, and it helps him, find the courage to really do what it is that he does. Because in general, a Sun in Cancer person, you wouldn't think they'd be a fighter, but with that trine from Mars, that brings in more of that strength and courage to his personality. Now, some other interesting things about his natal chart is that he has Saturn at 27 degrees Sagittarius conjunct Uranus at 28 degrees of Sagittarius. So he has a Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sag. So when we think about Saturn and Uranus together, they're almost like polar opposites. Like Saturn's about discipline and hard work, and then Uranus is about freedom and no boundaries and no limits and, no structure. So the two of them are kind of like there together, trying to get along, trying to work together. This could be somebody that's just very good, not only at disciplining themselves, but also in unique ways, in unusual ways, in ways that, he needs to have a lot of freedom in his work and his the way he goes about creating foundation and structure in his life. And in Sagittarius, of course, he wants to work in a way that gives him even more freedom in his life, because Sag wants new experiences, wants to expand its horizons, so he really has, I would say, a lot of drive there when it comes to his desire to really work hard but doing it in a way that allows him to have the freedom that he seeks in his life. And of course, those two planets also square his Mars in Aries that we discussed. Again, an out of sign square, slightly wide, about 7 degrees from the Saturn and 8 degrees from the Uranus. But, to have Mars squared Uranus and Saturn, that does give him the ability to even work even harder at what he wants with Mars and Aries squaring those two planets. But it could also be somebody who just kind of like sometimes is a little unpredictable. Mars squared Uranus. Uranus is like the wild card, the coyote, the trickster, squaring how he asserts himself. In fact, this could perhaps at times get him into trouble, because it's like not thinking before you act. Although Saturn is there to be like, okay, let's kind of slow our roll a little bit, and of course, with the Mars squared Saturn, that gives him a lot of energy to really work hard. He really can put the time into whatever it is he's trying to create in his life. So he also has an interesting T-square in his chart, and it involves that Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius, squaring the Mars at 0 degrees Aries, and then that Mars squares his Mercury at 2 degrees Cancer, which opposes that Saturn-Uranus conjunction. So what's interesting about him, to me, is that he definitely is known for being kind of a shit talker. He does it a lot to hype up his fights, and with that Mercury in Cancer squared Mars in Aries, that to me describes that part of him that really can kind of just, get under people's skin with the things that he tries to say. And then, of course, with the Mercury opposite the Uranus, that just means, what is he going to say? We don't know. It's, very unexpected. And with the Saturn, Mercury opposite Saturn, that can be kind of like biting words sometimes, a little cold, a little just not so friendly, not so nice. So there's just this interesting T-square going on in his chart with those energies. But at the same time, he's a Taurus rising, which is ruled by Venus. So, people gravitate towards him. People like him. He's friendly. And then he's got Jupiter right there on his ascendant at 28 degrees of Taurus. His ascendant's 22 degrees and his Jupiter's at 28 degrees. So that makes his personality, his ascendant, kind of Jupiterian, kind of Sagittarian. So, he does kind of have this jovial energy about him, and people like that part of him. They find him to be kind of easy to be around, and they enjoy hanging out with him and that kind of thing. So let's talk about a few more transits that are going on in his life that might be contributing to some of the things that he's experiencing right now. He is also having transiting Neptune conjuncting his North Node at 15 degrees Pisces. So the North Node has to do with the general picture. It's kind of like our soul's incarnation, what we're here to kind of move towards in this lifetime. And they say that the South Node is where we've come from, the North Node is where we're going. So North Node in Pisces, this is going to be somebody who actually is here to learn more about the spiritual world, you know, the world of compassion and the world of imagination and creativity and things that the experience of transcending the self. Now, of course, you look at him right now and you don't really think that about him because if you've seen him, I mean, he just really has this way of flashing his money and all of this stuff, you know. But, you know, North Node in Pisces, this could also be taking on the archetype of the actor, of the you know, the glamorous person, you know, the untouchable. So perhaps it could be playing out that way a little bit for him at this time in his life. But ultimately, you know, there may be a time in his life where he grows more into this other aspect of Pisces, where it's learning about being compassionate and learning about selflessness. Then with the Neptune, especially on that North Node right now, it's like, okay, maybe this is the time where some of that energy will be beginning to shift and change for him. We'll just have to see, but that's happening right now at this time. But also, as that Neptune conjuncts his North Node, it's squaring his Venus at 15 degrees Gemini. So this is what I find interesting about this incident that happened yesterday, because one of the things that Dana White was talking about, the owner of the UFC, was that he feels there's going to be a lot of lawsuits coming out of this incident from other UFC members that got hurt in the incident, and perhaps even the UFC itself. I mean, they had to cancel 3 of their fights tomorrow, so it's hard to say exactly where those lawsuits would be coming from specifically. But when you have transiting Neptune squaring your Venus, Venus is your money. Venus is your creativity. Venus is your loving energy. But specifically in this instance, it's about, you know, it could be playing itself out with like dissolving finances, because Neptune has that kind of foggy, like dissolving quality to it, where it's like, it's just hard to grasp. It's hard to get a handle on. It can literally just like dissolve your finances because of Venus being the symbol for money. And again, from futureminders.com, they say about transiting Neptune squaring your Venus, money concerns can emerge during this period. And they talk about it in a way of like you're self-indulgent, because Venus is about things we like. Venus is about our pleasures. So with Neptune squaring the Venus, you might not be thinking very clearly, and you might be, you know, more drawn towards things that are not, you know, that are more expensive and than you should be spending money on, type of thing. But I see it as perhaps also just this sort of liquidating the funds. You know, it could really affect his finances if this turns into something, you know, more serious. What is also interesting, though, is that Jupiter is trining his sun and his moon right now. Jupiter is, this started in February of this year, and it's going to continue until November of this year. And Jupiter is luck. Jupiter's expansion, expanding our horizons, expanding our perspective, expanding the horizons and perspective of those around us. It can be a very lucky time. So that's why it's interesting that, you know, like Dana White was talking initially about, oh, it's going to cost Conor a lot of money, and he's disgusted with him. And then it kind of turned into like, well, I can't say for sure he's never going to fight for the UFC again. So, you know, with this Jupiter trining the sun and the moon, it's indicating that perhaps, you know, there's more going on here that will actually be in Conor's favor ultimately. He's also having transiting Saturn conjunct his Neptune. And this is something that only happens once every 30 years. So when we have transiting Saturn conjuncting our Neptune, his Neptune is at 8 degrees of Capricorn in the 9th house. Saturn, you know, has this element of discipline, of grounding us, whereas Neptune is basically the opposite. Neptune is about transcending the self and letting go and dissolving. So it's interesting that he's having this transit at this time. Perhaps, you know, it will be bringing in some sort of crystallization of a spiritual perspective for him, you know, or at least at the very least, perhaps limiting him in these excessive, perhaps, ways of working with Neptune. Because one other thing that Dana White said was, and his initial kind of reaction to it was, I don't know if this guy's on drugs or not, but he's acting really wild, you know? And so Saturn on that Neptune could potentially be just causing some sort of limiting element to be brought into his life at this time around anything regarding drug use, if that is the case, but possibly also just solidifying some sort of spiritual perspective or spiritual path in his life. And again, from futureminders.com, they say about this particular transit that it can be a time to focus on what's vague and to get a handle on certain areas of your life that are elusive. The potential exists to make dreams a reality during this cycle, especially if you have a clear vision of what you seek. Circumstances tend to show you how to put into form what before you could only imagine. To the extent that you're off track or uncertain, however, this cycle can force you to take a look at what you ordinarily overlook or avoid. It's typically a reality check that can be uncomfortable if you are in the habit of hiding things from yourself and others. Sometimes this period highlights vulnerabilities and weaknesses that seem to stand in the way of what you wish to attain. Often it's easy to blame others for whatever is lacking. While that can occur now, you can strengthen your position by taking your share of responsibility for any shortcomings that may appear in front of you at this time. Indeed, this can be a time where you can put particular aspects of your life in order that have been in disarray by taking steps to arrive at the truth of any matter. Making distinctions between what's important and what is ephemeral can help you to clear away all that is unnecessary so that you can make a new start with a clear perspective of what matters to you. So that's another transit that he's going through at this time that, you know, will be interesting for him to continue to experience. And finally, he's having progressed Mercury move into Virgo. And in his chart, he was born again with Mercury in Gemini, and now it's in Virgo. So Mercury is comfortable in Virgo because Virgo actually is ruled by the planet Mercury. And to have your Mercury progress into Virgo can mean that this is a time where you do begin to kind of become more discriminating around the way you think and the way you communicate. And, you know, it's just going to be perhaps a helpful energy if this is a time where he needs to look a little bit more closely at himself and make some changes. Mercury in Virgo will help him be able to really discern and discriminate in that way for himself. So this has been my interpretation of Conor McGregor's chart. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you like my channel. And I can be reached for readings at info@highaltitudeastrology.com. Thanks so much for watching. Adios.